What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I have a theory. Sylvie created the Illuminati. Not intentionally, but she created them. Okay, let's explain this a little bit. We're gonna have to invoke a little bit of comic book knowledge. Granted, Marvel Cinematic Universe plays by its own rules, but they do borrow from Marvel Comics. So, to make this simple, let's say there's Timeline A and Timeline B. Timeline A is everything that's happened in the history of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Every origin story, when Odin opened up with Thor, the Dark World, and told us like the very early days of things, the creation of the Infinity Stones, everything you've ever seen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, chronologically, leading up to the events of the end of Loki, that's Timeline A. Now, our perception switched from Timeline A to Timeline B when Sylvie killed He Who Remains. Here's the reason why. So as you guys know from our different discussions, and really just in general regarding the events of Loki, that when Sylvie killed He Who Remains, the whole role that He Who Remains had was to basically eliminate universes that would lead to the creation of Kang the Conqueror. So the multiverse existed. It's just that the only universes that did exist were universes that would lead to the creation of He Who Remains, as opposed to Kang the Conqueror. So if Tony Stark and Pepper Potts are walking through the park and a bird craps in Tony Stark's eye, and that leads to the formation of Kang the Conqueror, then the TVA would step in and they would prune that universe. Probably kill a bird. Good job, bird. You killed a whole universe. But that's basically the role the TVA played. Loki was part of it and Sylvie was kind of a part of it, but not necessarily. But our perception switching to Timeline B, the question has to be asked, how did it change? Right? Sylvie killed He Who Remains, she pushed Loki through a portal back to the TVA headquarters, but when Loki got there, no one knew who he was. He'd been working all this time with Owen Wilson, but Owen Wilson had no idea who Loki was. No one did. And instead of there being statues of the Timekeepers, there were statues of Kang the Conqueror. Now remember, the TVA exists outside of time. So it's not as though Loki was pushed to some alternate universe version of the TVA. There's only one time variance authority in the entirety of the multiverse. So the only way to adequately answer this question is to say that when He Who Remains died and the multiverse was spiraling out of control, essentially all these different alternate universes that would eventually give birth to Kang the Conqueror all came into existence. Perhaps this multiversal war started again, we're not entirely sure. What we do know is that seemingly one of those Kangs went back to the very beginning of the timeline, or whenever the original multiversal war happened, ensured that they won, and they're the ones who formed the Time Variance Authority. Now exactly what role the Time Variance Authority played in this Timeline B, we're not entirely sure. The only thing that we really get that gives us any kind of preview or insight into it is when Loki ends up back at the TVA and everybody's under the control of Kang the Conqueror. One, for them, it's always been that way. There's never any indication they have any idea of who Immortus is. As far as they're concerned, they've always worked for Kang, and the TVA has always been controlled by Kang. The other thing that goes on is they're saying, let the multiverse grow, right? Let all these alternate realities come into existence. Do not stop them. That's what he wants. That's what he wants to have happen. And so if that's the case, then when it comes to Marvel Comics in general, one of the things that's been solidified over and over and over again, specifically during Jonathan Hickman's Avengers, New Avengers, Jonathan Hickman's Avengers, New Avengers, oh God. One of the things that's just been hit at over and over again when it comes to this is that basically the multiverse exists in a form of balance. There's a yin for every yang. That's been said time and time again. Baron Mordo said it in the Doctor Strange films, that seemingly it exists whenever the TVA is talking, that this kind of balance always has to be maintained. Now traditionally, this is a role that would be maintained for the Living Tribunal. The Living Tribunal would exist to make sure there's always a multiversal balance. But what do we know about the Living Tribunal? Well, we don't really know much outside of the fact that his head was basically in the graveyard of places that had been pruned by the Time Variance Authority. We don't know if it was really a statue or if like the Living Tribunal had been destroyed or whatever the case is, but like a statue of his head was in that graveyard of places where things had been pruned. And that was basically it. But as far as we're aware, the Living Tribunal does not exist in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, this is where the theory comes into play, or at least the comic book knowledge of the theory comes into play. So during Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, when the multiverse was collapsing and everything was coming to an end, on one side you had the Illuminati. So Reed Richards, Black Panther, Namor the Submariner, all those guys who were basically working together to try to find a way to end the multiversal incursions. On the other side, you had the White Lords of Wild Space, right? The Beyonders, the ones who had kind of caused it, but not really. Then you had Doctor Doom and the Molecule Man as the actual cause of the multiversal incursions. But then you had the Black Priests. Now, we've talked about the Black Priests before here on Geek Culture Explained, and they are a phenomenal concept. But basically, we didn't know where the Black Priests came from in Jonathan Hickman's Avengers, New Avengers. All we knew is that they were just suddenly there, right? That when the Illuminati were using the bridge of Reed Richards to look into alternate realities, that they saw these Black Priests were showing up to entire universes and destroying them, right? Wiping them all out in their entirety. Technically, they were destroying the Earths, because if you destroy the Earth, then there is no point where the Earths can make contact and the universe can be destroyed. It's a great big huge thing. The whole point is that the Black Priests are basically destroying Earths to prevent the multiversal collapse. What we ended up learning here is that if the multiverse was a living organism, which is to say a human being that could get up and walk around, the Black Priests were the antibodies. That's all they were. It was the multiverse's own defense system trying to ensure its survival to make sure that it wouldn't die out with the multiversal collapse. Eventually, Doctor Strange took over the Black Priests. Now, I'm not saying the Illuminati are the Black Priests. What I'm saying here is that when Sylvie went and killed He Who Remains, she changed not simply just the TVA, but the entirety of the multiversal time stream, the whole 9 yards. She basically reset the multiverse, right? Except this time, it was not He Who Remains that won the multiversal war, it was Kang who won the multiversal war. But if the purpose behind the TVA was to guard the sacred timeline, they were able to maintain some kind of a balance, and seemingly the multiverse existed in harmony. Nobody really had any complaints outside of Sylvie. But the thing about this is that with all of that gone, the multiverse just running amok, any possibility that can exist does exist, which means somebody has to maintain order. And so whether it was a result of circumstance or some metatextual concept, the Illuminati was essentially formed as a result of the death of He Who Remains and the absence of the TVA as we traditionally know them. Now, the reason why I say this is one of those metatextual things is because you could literally argue, and they do this in comics all the time, you could argue it was just kind of the way the cards fell, right? It was the universe sort of organizing things in such a way to where a group would rise that would serve the purpose of trying to safeguard the multiverse. Here's the real kicker about this. The question you have to ask is, do the Illuminati know about Kang the Conqueror? Do they know any of the events that happened in Loki? And my answer to that question would be no. The Illuminati would have no idea. The only person who knows what's going on with the timeline as a result of the death of He Who Remains and the idea of Kang and all that kind of stuff is Loki. Loki's the only one who knows the way that things were originally supposed to be. He's the only one who knows, right? Because seemingly he's the only one who witnessed the death of Immortus. When he went back to the TVA, nobody knew him, right? Owen Wilson, none of those guys. It's not like he went back to the TVA and he was like, Owen Wilson, man, everything's popping off, right? It's the end times, it's just, He Who Remains is dead, Sylvie killed him, and now everything's changing, and Owen's like, okay, to the Batcave, Loki, and then they went to go solve the problem. That's not what happened. Right? They didn't know him. So as far as Owen Wilson and them were concerned, it had always been that way. And I would say with the Illuminati, it's going to be the exact same thing. That as far as they're concerned, the multiverse had always been like this because there's nothing to indicate that it hadn't. They weren't aware of how things were before everything changed. But that's the idea behind this theory, right? That's my thought here, that Sylvie inadvertently created the Illuminati, that the Illuminati are really, in effect, the multiverse trying to fix itself, the multiverse trying to correct things. Now, it could be that I'm entirely wrong here. Honestly, I don't really care. But the cool thing is that I love this possibility. I love this idea that the Illuminati are basically the result of just fate, if that's what you want to call it, right? That in this new timeline, things just aren't right. And the multiverse is trying to set itself back to where things are supposed to be. And by virtue of fate or the hand of God, whatever you want to call it, it's just kind of rearranging the pieces in such a way to where an alternative to the TVA emerges, right? That there's always a kind of similarity, that there's always some kind of yin to a yang or something along those lines. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. I'm curious what your ideas are on this. And thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.